Captain Maria Santos had seen the ocean in every mood. She had watched it rage with the fury of a wounded beast, sending waves tall as apartment buildings crashing across her ship's deck. She had sailed through hurricanes, where the wind screamed so loud it drowned out her own thoughts, where the rain fell sideways like bullets from an angry sky. She had navigated through ice fields where bergs the size of cathedrals drifted silently in the polar darkness, ready to crush her vessel like an empty soda can. For 37 years, she had commanded cargo ships across every ocean on Earth. She had delivered supplies to oil rigs in the North Sea during winter storms that would have sent lesser captains running for port. She had guided her crew through typhoons in the Pacific, where the compass spun uselessly and the GPS signals vanished into the electronic chaos of the storm. She had even survived being trapped in pack ice for 6 weeks near Antarctica, rationing food and melting snow for water while waiting for rescue. The ocean had tried to kill her more times than she could count. Lightning had struck her ship's mast while she stood just 20 feet away, the electricity dancing across the metal railings like blue fire. Rogue waves had swept 3 crew members overboard during her early years as a captain, and she still woke some nights hearing their voices calling from the water. She had seen tornadoes form over the Gulf of Mexico, their dark funnels reaching down from storm clouds like the fingers of an angry god trying to pluck her ship from the surface. But none of that had prepared her for what happened on a calm Tuesday morning in international waters 200 miles off the coast of Somalia. Maria was reviewing shipping manifests in her cabin when her first officer, James Chen, knocked on her door. James had sailed with her for 12 years. He was steady, reliable, never one to panic. But when she opened the door, his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Captain, we have a situation," he said quietly. 3 boats approaching from the southeast. Small craft, high speed. They're not responding to radio contact. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her stomach that came before danger. She had been expecting this. The shipping company had briefed her about increased pirate activity in these waters, but the route saved them 4 days and thousands of dollars in fuel costs. The cargo was medical supplies bound for Kenya, desperately needed antibiotics and surgical equipment for refugee camps. Every day delayed meant people would die waiting. She followed James to the bridge, where her crew was gathered around the radar screen. The 3 boats showed as bright green dots moving fast toward their position. Through her binoculars, Maria could see them clearly now. They were small fiberglass boats with powerful outboard motors, the kind used by local fishermen. But these weren't fishermen. Each boat carried 4 or 5 men, and even from this distance, she could see the distinctive outline of assault rifles. The boats moved with purpose, staying spread apart in a triangular formation that would make it impossible for her ship to outrun all of them. Maria's ship, the Atlantic Voyager, was a merchant vessel built for cargo, not speed. She could make maybe 15 knots in good conditions. The approaching boats were easily doing 30 knots, bouncing across the waves like angry wasps. "How long until they reach us?" Maria asked her navigator, Sarah Williams. Sarah checked her calculations quickly. "At their current speed and course, maybe 20 minutes. Maria felt the same cold calculation that had kept her alive through countless storms. She had options, but none of them were good. She could try to outrun them, but her ship was too slow, and there was nowhere to hide on the open ocean. She could call for help, but the nearest naval vessel was at least 6 hours away. She could try to negotiate, but she had heard the stories about what happened to crews who fell into the hands of these particular pirates. The radio crackled to life. A voice speaking accented English came through the static. "Cargo ship Atlantic Voyager, this is Captain Omar. You will stop your engines and prepare to be boarded. Do not attempt to run, or we will sink you." Maria picked up the radio handset. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the fear that was building in her chest. "This is Captain Santos of the Atlantic Voyager. We are carrying medical supplies for humanitarian aid. I repeat, We are carrying humanitarian medical supplies." The laughter that came back through the radio was harsh and cold. "Captain Santos, we do not care what you carry. Medicine brings good money too. Stop your engines now, or my men will put holes in your hull." Maria looked around the bridge at her crew. There were 12 people on board, including herself. James, who had a wife and twin daughters back in San Diego. Sarah, who was saving money to buy her parents a house in the Philippines. Miguel, the young engineer from Mexico who sent most of his salary home to support his extended family. Maria had sailed with most of these people for years. They trusted her to keep them safe. She had faced down Category 5 hurricanes without this feeling in her stomach. She had navigated through icebergs in zero visibility without her hands shaking like this. She had even survived a fire in the engine room that had filled the ship with toxic smoke, organizing the firefighting effort while breathing through a wet towel. But this was different. The ocean was predictable in its unpredictability. A storm had rules, patterns you could learn and anticipate. Ice behaved according to physics and temperature. Even fire followed the laws of chemistry, consuming oxygen and fuel in ways that could be calculated and countered. But humans were different. Humans could choose to be cruel for no reason. They could decide to hurt you even when it served no purpose. They could look into your eyes and see your fear and feed on it like sharks smelling blood in the water. "Captain," James said quietly, "what are your orders?" Maria watched the 3 boats getting closer. Through her binoculars, she could now see the faces of the men aboard them. Young faces, mostly, hard and weathered by sun and salt spray. She could see their weapons more clearly now, too. AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns mounted on the bows of 2 boats. These weren't desperate fishermen driven to piracy by poverty, though that's how they had started. These were professionals now, part of an organization that controlled hundreds of square miles of ocean. They had attacked 17 ships in the past 6 months. Most crews were released after ransoms were paid, but 3 ships had simply vanished, their crews never heard from again. Maria had read the intelligence reports. She knew what these men were capable of. She had seen the photos of crew members who had been tortured to convince shipping companies to pay ransoms faster. She had read the testimonies of survivors who described weeks of captivity in desert camps, constantly threatened with death, watching their captors play sadistic games with their lives. The radio crackled again. "Captain Santos, this is your final warning. Stop your engines or we begin shooting." Maria looked out at the 3 boats, now less than a mile away. She could see muzzle flashes as someone fired a burst into the air, the sound reaching her a few seconds later as a distant popping, like firecrackers. She had survived 1,000 storms, but she had never been more afraid than she was at this moment. Because storms, no matter how violent, eventually ended. The ocean, no matter how angry, eventually calmed. The wind, no matter how fierce, eventually stopped blowing. But human cruelty could last forever. "Cut engines," she ordered quietly. "Prepare to be boarded." The words felt like surrender, like the first time in her career that she had backed down from a fight. But as she watched her crew begin the procedures for receiving unwanted guests, Maria Santos realized she was about to learn something new about fear. Something that 37 years of battling the ocean's worst fury had never taught her. She was about to discover that the most dangerous predators on Earth didn't have claws or fangs or stingers. They didn't need venom or crushing strength or razor-sharp teeth. They just needed to be human. As the first boat pulled alongside her ship and rough hands threw grappling hooks over her railings, Maria felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. She had commanded vessels through Arctic blizzards and tropical hurricanes. She had faced down rogue waves and electrical storms and crushing ice flows, but none of that had prepared her for the cold, calculating intelligence in the eyes of the first man who climbed aboard her ship. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who owned whatever he chose to take. His weapon was held easily, professionally, like an extension of his own arm. When he looked at her, Maria saw something that made her blood freeze. It wasn't anger or desperation or even greed, though all of those were there too. It was the complete absence of any recognition that she was a human being deserving of basic consideration. In his eyes, she was just another piece of cargo to be processed, evaluated, and disposed of according to his convenience. Maria Santos had spent her entire adult life learning to read the ocean's moods, to predict when a calm sea might suddenly turn violent, to recognize the signs of approaching danger in the color of clouds or the pattern of waves. She was an expert at surviving forces of nature that could crush her ship like tissue paper. But standing on her own bridge, watching armed strangers take control of everything she had worked decades to earn, she realized that all her experience with natural disasters had been inadequate preparation for this moment. The ocean, for all its power and unpredictability, was not evil. It was simply indifferent. It might kill you, but it wouldn't torture you first. It might destroy everything you had built, but it wouldn't make you watch while it did. These men, she was beginning to understand, were something far more dangerous than any hurricane or tsunami or ice storm she had ever faced. They were human beings who had chosen to abandon every moral constraint that made civilization possible. And for the first time in her long career, battling nature's worst fury, Captain Maria Santos was truly afraid. The man who climbed aboard first introduced himself as Bashir. He was younger than Maria had expected, maybe 35, with intelligent eyes and a neat beard. He spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had learned it in school rather than picking it up on the streets. When he smiled, which he did often, it never reached his eyes. "Captain Santos," he said, extending his hand as if they were meeting at a business conference rather than a piracy operation. "I have heard good things about you. You have a reputation for being reasonable." Maria did not shake his hand. She kept her arms at her sides and met his gaze directly. "What do you want?" Bashir's smile widened slightly, but there was something predatory about it now. "Straight to business. I respect that. What I want is very simple. Your cooperation while my men conduct an inventory of your cargo, your radio codes and communication schedules, and most importantly, your complete honesty about the value of what you're carrying." Behind him, more men were climbing aboard. Maria counted 8 in total, all armed with automatic weapons. They moved with military precision, immediately taking positions that gave them clear fields of fire across the entire deck. 2 men headed for the engine room, while another went to disable the ship's communications equipment. "We're carrying medical supplies," Maria said. "Antibiotics, surgical equipment, basic medicines. Nothing valuable enough to justify what you're doing here." Bashir laughed, and this time it sounded genuinely amused. "Captain, please don't insult my intelligence. We know exactly what you're carrying because we know exactly who paid for this shipment. The European Union doesn't spend $2 million on basic medicines." Maria's blood went cold. The cargo manifest she had been given listed standard medical supplies worth perhaps $200,000. But if Bashir was right about the real value, that meant someone had lied to her. Someone had used her ship to transport something far more valuable without telling her, putting her crew at risk without their knowledge or consent. "I don't know anything about $2 million, she said. "I was given a standard manifest for humanitarian aid supplies." Bashir studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded to one of his men, who immediately moved behind Sarah and pressed the muzzle of his rifle against the back of her neck. "Captain," Bashir said, his voice still friendly and conversational, "I'm going to ask you that question again. But first, let me tell you a story about the last captain who lied to me." Maria felt her heart rate spike. She had faced down countless storms, but those had been battles against forces of nature. The ocean didn't threaten her crew to manipulate her. Lightning didn't take hostages to ensure cooperation. Even the most violent hurricane didn't look her in the eye while deciding whether to kill the people she was responsible for protecting. His name was Captain Petrov, Bashir continued, settling comfortably against the ship's railing as if he were telling a story at a dinner party. Russian fellow, very stubborn. His ship was carrying what the manifest claimed were industrial chemicals, but my sources told me he was actually transporting something much more interesting. Maria watched Sarah's face. The young navigator was trying to stay calm, but Maria could see the terror in her eyes. Sarah had joined her crew straight out of Maritime Academy. She was brilliant with charts and navigation systems, but she had never faced anything like this. Captain Petrov insisted he knew nothing about any valuable cargo, Bashir went on. He was very convincing, very sincere, so I decided to help him remember. Bashir nodded to another of his men, who produced a pair of bolt cutters from his equipment bag. We started with his first officer's fingers, Bashir said casually. Just the little finger on his left hand at first. Amazing how quickly people's memory improves when they hear that sound. You know the sound I mean, Captain? Metal cutting through bone? Maria's mouth went dry. She had heard sounds like that during storms when rigging snapped under pressure, when metal cables parted under stress, but she had never heard it applied to human beings. It took 3 fingers before Captain Petrov remembered that his industrial chemicals were actually rare earth minerals worth $12 million, Bashir continued. By then, of course, his first officer was in shock from blood loss. We had to throw him overboard. Sharks in these waters, you understand. Maria looked around at her crew. James was standing near the wheel, his face pale but determined. Miguel had been brought up from the engine room at gunpoint. The rest of her people were lined up along the starboard rail, guards positioned to watch them. These were good people. James sent pictures of his daughter's soccer games to Maria's email every weekend. Sarah called her grandmother in Manila every Sunday morning, no matter where they were in the world. Miguel was studying for his master's engineer certification in his spare time, dreaming of commanding his own ship someday. Maria had kept them safe through typhoons and ice storms and mechanical failures. She had navigated them through fog so thick they couldn't see their own bow. She had guided them past icebergs and around waterspouts and through seas rough enough to break a lesser ship in half. But she couldn't protect them from this. Now then, Bashir said, shall we try this again? What is the real value of your cargo? Maria stared at him, trying to read his intentions. In her experience with storms, there were always signs if you knew how to look for them. Changes in air pressure, shifts in wind direction, the color of clouds on the horizon. But looking into Bashir's eyes, she saw something that had no natural equivalent. She saw a human being who had discovered that causing suffering gave him pleasure, and who had organized his entire life around maximizing opportunities to inflict pain on others. I honestly don't know, she said. I was given the same manifest I always receive. If someone is lying about the cargo value, they lied to me too. Bashir studied her for another long moment. Then he smiled and nodded to his man behind Sarah. The sound of the rifle butt hitting Sarah's skull was sharp and wet, like a branch breaking in a storm. Sarah collapsed to the deck, blood streaming from her scalp. That was for making me repeat my question, Bashir said pleasantly. The next one will be a bullet. Now, Captain, let's discuss the real contents of your cargo hold. Maria dropped to her knees beside Sarah, checking her pulse and trying to stop the bleeding with her shirt sleeve. Sarah was unconscious but breathing. The wound looked like it needed stitches, but it probably wasn't life-threatening if they could keep it clean. As she knelt there, cradling her injured crew member, Maria realized something that made her stomach clench with a fear deeper than any she had experienced in 3 decades at sea. In all her battles with the ocean, she had always been able to fight back. When a storm hit, she could change course, adjust speed, secure loose equipment, and ride it out. When waves threatened to swamp her deck, she could turn into them and use her ship's design to cut through the water. When ice threatened to crush her hull, she could use engines and rudder to find open leads between the flows. Even in the worst natural disasters, she had retained some control over her fate. She could make decisions, take actions, use her knowledge and experience to improve her chances of survival. But here, kneeling on her own deck with her navigator's blood on her hands, Maria realized that she had no power at all. Every choice she made could result in one of her crew members being hurt or killed. Every word she spoke could trigger violence against people who depended on her for protection. This wasn't like facing a hurricane, where courage and skill and determination could make the difference between survival and death. This was like being trapped in the path of an avalanche, watching tons of snow and rock bearing down on you, knowing that nothing you could do would change what was about to happen. Except the avalanche was human, and it was choosing to bury her. "Captain," Bashir said, and his voice was still conversational, still friendly. "I can see you're upset about your navigator. That's understandable. She's young, attractive. I'm sure she reminds you of a daughter or younger sister, but her condition is entirely under your control." He gestured to one of his men, who produced a small medical kit and began cleaning Sarah's wound with surprising gentleness. "I'm not a monster," Bashir said. "I don't enjoy hurting innocent people, but I am a businessman, and I have investors who expect results. If you help me conduct my business efficiently, everyone stays healthy. If you force me to waste time with games and deception, then people get hurt." Maria looked up at him from where she knelt beside Sarah. "I've told you the truth. I don't know anything about the real value of this cargo." "Then let's go find out together," Bashir said. He helped Maria to her feet with surprising courtesy, then gestured toward the cargo hold. "After you, Captain." As they walked across the deck, Maria caught James's eye. Her first officer was watching the guards, calculating distances and angles with the same methodical approach he used for navigation problems. Maria shook her head slightly. James had served in the Navy before joining her crew. He was trained for combat, and she could see him considering whether he could overpower one of the guards and get to the weapons locker. But there were too many of them, positioned too well. Any attempt at resistance would just get people killed. Maria led Bashir and two of his men down to the cargo hold. The space was filled with sealed shipping containers, each one labeled with medical supply company logos and customs documentation. Everything looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. Bashir produced a small crowbar and began opening containers at random. The first three contained exactly what the manifest said: antibiotics, surgical instruments, bags of saline solution. But when he opened the fourth container, Bashir's smile returned. Inside, nested among boxes of gauze and medical tape, were smaller containers marked with chemical symbols Maria didn't recognize. When Bashir opened one of these, she saw white powder in sealed plastic bags. "Pharmaceutical cocaine," Bashir explained helpfully. "Medical grade, used for certain types of surgery, but also popular for recreational purposes, particularly when refined. Street value of what we're looking at here is probably $3 million. Maria stared at the powder. She had been transporting drugs without knowing it. Someone at the shipping company had used her reputation for reliability to move illegal cargo, trusting that she would never look too closely at sealed medical containers. "Now you understand why your shipping company was so insistent that this cargo reach its destination quickly," Bashir said, "and why they were willing to pay extra for the fastest route, even through dangerous waters." Maria felt a cold rage building in her chest. She had been set up, manipulated into risking her crew's lives for a drug smuggling operation disguised as humanitarian aid. The antibiotics and surgical equipment were real, but they were just camouflage for the real cargo. "So," Bashir said, "now that we understand each other, let's discuss terms. My organization will be taking possession of this pharmaceutical cocaine. In exchange, you and your crew will be released unharmed once we confirm that your shipping company has paid a reasonable fee for our services." "How much?" Maria asked. $5 million, Bashir said casually, "which is quite reasonable considering the street value of what we're confiscating. Think of it as a tax on illegal activities." Maria did quick calculations in her head. The shipping company might pay to get their crew back, but they would never admit to smuggling drugs. They would claim the cargo was planted, deny any knowledge of illegal activities, and probably abandon the crew rather than pay a ransom that would amount to an admission of guilt, which meant she and her people were expendable. "And if they don't pay?" she asked. Bashir's smile faded slightly. "Captain, in 30 years of business, I have never failed to collect payment from a shipping company. Sometimes it takes longer than others, but they always pay eventually. What do you do to convince them?" "Whatever is necessary," Bashir said simply. Maria looked around the cargo hold, trying to think of options. She had faced impossible situations before, but always with some avenue for action. Even in the worst storms, she could at least try to fight her way through to safety. Here, she was completely helpless. Her crew's lives depended entirely on the mercy of men who had chosen to make their living through violence and intimidation. For the first time in her career, Captain Maria Santos understood what it meant to be truly afraid. Not afraid of dying, which she had faced many times, but afraid of being powerless to protect the people who trusted her. The ocean could kill you, but it couldn't make you watch while it tortured your friends first. Human beings, she was learning, were capable of far worse than anything nature had ever devised. The waiting was the worst part. Maria had been through 3-day storms where she couldn't leave the bridge, where she had to grip the wheel with white knuckles while her ship was battered by waves taller than buildings. She had spent weeks trapped in Arctic ice, rationing food and water while waiting for rescue. She had endured engine failures in the middle of the Pacific, drifting powerless while her crew worked around the clock to make repairs. But this was different. When you're fighting a storm, every minute brings new challenges that demand your attention. When you're trapped in ice, you can focus on conservation strategies and communication attempts. When your engines fail, you can work on solutions. When you're a hostage, all you can do is wait and try not to think about what might happen next. It had been 6 hours since Bashir's men had transferred the pharmaceutical cocaine to their boats and departed, leaving behind 4 guards to watch Maria's crew. The pirates had established a routine quickly. 2 guards stayed on the bridge at all times, monitoring radio frequencies and GPS coordinates. The other 2 patrolled the deck, making sure no one could access the weapons locker or the emergency communication equipment. Sarah had regained consciousness, though she was still dizzy from the head injury. Miguel had managed to whisper that he had disabled the ship's emergency beacon before the pirates could find it, but that meant they couldn't call for help even if they managed to overpower their guards. Maria sat in her cabin, officially under arrest, but allowed some privacy, while Bashir's organization contacted her shipping company to negotiate ransom terms. Through her porthole, she could see the endless expanse of the Indian Ocean, calm and peaceful under the afternoon sun. No storms on the horizon, no dangerous weather patterns forming on the satellite images she could no longer access. Just blue water stretching to the horizon, beautiful and serene and completely indifferent to the human drama playing out on her ship. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. One of the guards, a young man who had introduced himself as Adnan, entered without waiting for permission. "Captain," he said in accented English, "Bashir wants to speak with you." Maria followed Adnan to the bridge, where a satellite phone had been set up. Bashir's voice came through clearly, despite the distance. "Captain Santos, I have good news and bad news," he said without preamble. The good news is that your shipping company acknowledges receiving our message and understands our terms. The bad news is that they are claiming ignorance about the pharmaceutical cargo and refusing to pay the full amount." Maria's stomach tightened. She had been afraid of this. "What did they offer?" $500,000 for the safe return of crew and vessel," Bashir said. "Plus, they're threatening to involve the international maritime authorities if we don't accept immediately." "And your response?" Bashir laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My response is that they have 48 hours to reconsider, during which time I will be providing them with additional motivation to take our negotiations seriously." The line went dead. Maria looked at Adnan, who avoided her eyes. Whatever Bashir had planned for additional motivation, it wasn't something his men were comfortable discussing. Over the next 24 hours, Maria began to understand what that motivation would involve. The guards started taking her crew members away for what they called interviews, returning them after an hour or two with new bruises and a haunted look in their eyes. James was first. When he returned, he walked carefully, favoring his left side where someone had apparently kicked him repeatedly. He wouldn't talk about what had happened, just shook his head when Maria tried to ask. Then Miguel, who came back with his right hand wrapped in bloody bandages. When Sarah tried to examine his injuries, he pulled away and whispered that it was better not to know the details. One by one, Bashir's men were building a catalog of injuries and psychological pressure that could be transmitted to the shipping company as proof of their seriousness. Each crew member who disappeared for an interview returned as evidence that the situation was escalating according to a carefully planned schedule. Maria had survived storms that lasted for days, where the constant noise and motion and danger had pushed her crew to the edge of exhaustion and panic. But even in the worst weather, her people had been able to work together, to focus on tasks that might improve their situation. Here, they could only wait and endure whatever was done to them, knowing that resistance would make things worse. On the second day, Bashir called again. "Captain, I'm disappointed in your shipping company's response," he said. "They've increased their offer to 800,000, but they're still insisting they had no knowledge of the pharmaceutical cargo. They seem to think I'm bluffing about the consequences of continued non-cooperation." "What do you want me to do?" Maria asked. "I want you to help me convince them that I am very serious," Bashir said. "I'm going to have Adnan set up a video call. You're going to describe to your company representative exactly what has happened to your crew over the past 48 hours, and you're going to make it clear that things will get much worse if payment is not received within the next 24 hours. Maria found herself thinking about Hurricane Elena, the worst storm she had ever encountered. Winds over 150 miles per hour, waves 60 feet high, rain so heavy that visibility was reduced to zero. She had kept her ship together through 18 hours of conditions that should have killed everyone on board. But Elena had been predictable in her own way. The storm had followed meteorological laws, developing and moving according to patterns that could be studied and understood. Even at its worst, Elena was trying to achieve an equilibrium, to balance pressure and temperature differentials according to the physics of weather systems. Bashir wasn't trying to achieve equilibrium. He was trying to create maximum psychological impact through the calculated application of suffering. He wasn't responding to natural forces or working toward any kind of balance. He was simply choosing to cause pain because pain served his purposes. The video call was set up in Maria's cabin. Through the laptop screen, she could see Richard Morrison, the vice president of operations for her shipping company. Morrison was a bureaucrat who had never been to sea, never faced any danger more serious than a delayed flight. "Captain Santos," Morrison said, "I want to assure you that we're doing everything possible to resolve this situation. We've contacted the appropriate authorities, and we're exploring all diplomatic channels." Maria looked directly into the camera. "Richard, they broke Miguel's fingers with pliers. They burned James with cigarettes. They made Sarah watch while they beat the other crew members, telling her she would be next if I didn't cooperate." Morrison's face went pale. "Captain, I want you to know that we had no knowledge of any illegal cargo aboard your vessel. The manifest we provided was accurate according to our understanding." "That's not going to matter if you don't pay the ransom," Maria said. "These people aren't interested in your legal position. They're interested in getting paid for the drugs they found in our cargo hold." "We cannot and will not pay ransom for illegal activities we did not authorize," Morrison said stiffly. "That would set a dangerous precedent and could expose the company to criminal liability." Maria stared at the screen. In that moment, she realized that her shipping company was going to abandon her crew rather than admit to drug smuggling. They would claim the cocaine was planted, deny any knowledge of illegal activities, and let her people die rather than pay money that could be traced back to criminal activity. "Richard," she said quietly, "if you don't pay this ransom, these people are going to start killing my crew. They've already shown me what they're capable of. This isn't a negotiating position, this is a statement of fact. Captain, I understand you're under tremendous stress, but we have to consider the broader implications of our response. We cannot allow ourselves to be extorted by criminal organizations." Maria closed the laptop without saying goodbye. She looked at Adnan, who had been listening to the conversation with an expression of professional interest. "Your company is making a mistake," Adnan said simply. "Bashir always collects payment. Always." That night, Maria lay awake in her bunk, listening to the sound of the ocean against her ship's hull. It was a sound she had found comforting for 37 years, the rhythm of waves that connected her to every part of the world she had ever sailed. But tonight the sound reminded her of how isolated they were. 200 miles from the nearest land, with no way to call for help and no reasonable hope of rescue. They were trapped on their own ship, surrounded by an ocean that had suddenly become their prison instead of their highway. She had been in worse physical danger many times. She had sailed through conditions that could have sunk her ship in minutes. She had faced mechanical failures that could have left them stranded and helpless. She had even survived a fire that had filled the engine room with toxic smoke. But she had never felt this helpless, this completely at the mercy of forces beyond her control. The next morning, Bashir called with his final offer. "Captain, your company has made their position clear," he said. "They're offering $1 million final payment, with the understanding that this concludes all negotiations. They've also informed me that they've reported this incident to international maritime authorities and that military vessels are being dispatched to this area." Maria felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe rescue was coming. Maybe her company had been bluffing about abandoning them. "However," Bashir continued, "military vessels are at least 36 hours away from your position, which gives us time to conclude our business arrangement in a more traditional manner." The hope died. "What does that mean?" "It means your company has chosen to treat this as a law enforcement matter rather than a business transaction," Bashir said, "which means I have no further use for their cooperation." Maria understood. If rescue ships were coming, Bashir would disappear long before they arrived. But he would take everything of value with him, including the crew members who could be sold to other criminal organizations for additional profit. She had read the intelligence reports about what happened to crews who were taken to the desert camps in Somalia and Yemen. Some were held for months or years, while their families tried to raise ransom money privately. Others simply vanished into the network of human trafficking that fed on the chaos of the region's ongoing conflicts. Either way, her people would suffer for years before they died. "Captain," Bashir said, "you and your crew will be transferred to other vessels within the hour. Your ship will be scuttled to eliminate evidence of our encounter. I want you to know that I take no pleasure in this outcome. Your company's stubbornness has forced my hand." After the call ended, Maria sat alone in her cabin and tried to process what was about to happen. In a few hours, She and her crew would disappear into the same network of criminals that had produced Bashir and his organization. They would become commodities to be bought and sold, tortured and murdered according to the convenience of people who had chosen to make their living through human suffering. She thought about all the storms she had survived, all the natural disasters she had overcome through skill and determination and refusal to give up. She had always believed that courage and competence could overcome any challenge, that human ingenuity could find solutions to any problem. But what was happening now had nothing to do with skill or courage or ingenuity. It was simply a matter of falling into the hands of people who had decided that other human beings were objects to be exploited and disposed of as necessary. The ocean had tried to kill her many times, but it had never tried to break her spirit first. It had never tried to convince her that she was worthless, that her life had no meaning beyond what others chose to assign to it. Nature could destroy your body, but only humans could destroy your soul. A few minutes later, Adnan knocked on her door. "Captain, it's time to go." Maria stood up and walked to her porthole for one last look at the ocean that had been her home for 37 years. The water was still calm, still beautiful, still completely indifferent to human concerns. But as she turned away from the window, Maria realized something that surprised her. Despite everything that had happened, despite the fear that had consumed her for the past 3 days, she was not ready to give up. She had survived 1,000 storms not because she was fearless, but because she had learned to function despite fear. She had kept her crew alive through countless emergencies, not because she always knew what to do, but because she had never stopped looking for solutions even when solutions seemed impossible. The men who had taken her ship were more dangerous than any force of nature she had ever encountered, but they were still just men with human limitations and human weaknesses, and Maria Santos had not spent 37 years at sea just to surrender without a fight. As Adnan escorted her toward the deck where her crew was being assembled for transfer, Maria began to plan, not for escape, which was probably impossible, but for survival, for keeping her people alive long enough for someone to find them. She had learned to read the ocean's moods, to predict when calm seas might suddenly turn violent. Now she would learn to read human predators, to understand their patterns and exploit their overconfidence. The ocean had taught her that survival was always possible for those who refused to panic, who kept thinking and adapting and looking for opportunities even in the worst conditions. She was about to find out whether those lessons would work on dry land, in places where human cruelty had replaced natural disasters as the greatest threat to survival. But for the first time since Bashir's boats had appeared on the horizon, Captain Maria Santos was not afraid. She was angry. And anger, she had learned during 37 years of battling storms, was a much more useful emotion than fear when it came time to fight for your life.